Thank you. Thank you, Wes. Yeah, look, we're about to start. We're deliberately running behind schedule to make things run smoothly. So thanks everybody for coming. I'm just going to start, welcome you all, but we have some other welcomes and acknowledgements coming up. And I first wanted to do, I'm Lance Lloyd, by the way, from Winton Wetlands, but yeah, I just had some housekeeping to start with. In case of fire, meet out in the car park out the front. If you can, during the day, you want to stretch your legs or chat, if we can go out that door rather than going through the cafe, because there'll be potentially patrons there. But if you need to go to the bathrooms, they are straight through that door, through the cafe. If there are any issues during the day, happy to see myself, Karen, who you've checked in down the back there, or any of the other staff, Lisa or Luke, down the front here, thank you. Just come and have a chat with us. And also the speakers for the later sessions, if they wouldn't mind coming to see us during the session. That would be great. Yeah, I think you know the pattern is that we're going to have 20 minutes of talks, 5 minutes of questions, and then a Q&A at the end with all of the speakers. So I'd like to call Marty Potts up to give us an acknowledgement of country.
Thanks, Lance. On behalf of Sonia Cooper, who can't be with us here today, the Yorta Yorta people, today we meet on the traditional lands of the Yorta Yorta people, and I wish to acknowledge Yorta Yorta as the original owners of country of which we stand. I pay my respects to the Yorta Yorta ancestors, their elders past and present, their families, and to all other traditional owners present here today. And from the lands I'm from, Umininji Naju Badirigalna Jitangana Wakwak. Honour to the land. Hey, where have you come from? You now stand on Kaurna Kurnok country. This is our land, this is us. I love acknowledgement of country, and I thank you, Lance, for giving me that. My ancestors are Scottish and Irish and English, and I honour those ancestors and those ancestors that acknowledged country and worked on land. And acknowledging traditional culture, to me, I love, because we acknowledge traditional people, we acknowledge country. And it's a country we work on, it's a country we are. So honour to your ancestors that brought you all here, and honour to the good work that you all do. And thank you.
And I invite Dennis up.
Thanks, Martin. Whoops, just stand out here. Do what you're told, Dennis. I don't really have a lot to say, except it's great to see you all in 3 dimensions for a start instead of 2, and to be out and about. I think we've got a great program today, and I think one of the best things about these forums is the opportunity to get together, both with question time and over coffee and so forth. So enjoy the day, and welcome to Winton Wetlands. I'm not going to say much about the wetlands because I've got a spot later where I'm going to be talking about warts and all on what we've been up to. But anyway, welcome, and have a great couple of days.
Thanks very much, Dennis. So you've almost all seen this, that we're really talking about 3 elements of restoration, wetland restoration, over the 2 days. The first one is about rewilding iconic species, because some species just need that little extra help to be able to re-establish them on site. Also, the second session this afternoon is around communities of practice for restoration, because it's not only what we do that's important, but it's also how we do it. And we want to explore that in a little bit more detail. And lastly, wetlands don't exist in isolation, and they're often surrounded by grasslands, or in fact have grassland elements. And so it's really important that we understand more about that. And we haven't been doing a lot of that here, and it's something we're really keen to learn more about ourselves, and I'm sure others are too. So with that, the other thing I should have acknowledged was that we've actually been sponsored by the Faux Productions. So you probably heard that Faux is a film that's being filmed on site here. You probably saw some of the infrastructure as you drove up the roads, and they very kindly sponsored our event here so we can actually have, a bit more high tech. We're recording the sessions that will be going onto the website eventually, and so that's one of the great things that they've been able to do, as well as support us more generally in the site. And I'm sure they'll be very keen for people to watch the movie when it comes out next year. So with that, we'll move to our first speaker and the first session around rewilding species. And so we're hoping to cover quite a bit of ground here. So Peter Rose from North Central CMA has been working on small native fish, and he's going to tell us all about it. Over to you. You've got a...
Thanks, Lance. Yep. The presentation, do I show? Okay, thank you. That's okay. And just use the computer to click through the slides? Yeah. No, that's okay. All good. No, that's fine. I'll start anyway. Good morning, everybody. My name's Peter Rose. I work for North Central Catchment Management Authority, but today I'm representing the Tri-State Murray Alliance. So the Tri-State Alliance is all of the Northern Catchment Management Authorities in Victoria, Southern Local Land Services in New South Wales, so Murray and Western Local Land Service, and SA Landscapes in South Australia. And we, the Tri-State Alliance, I guess, was formed in recognition that we need to be working at these larger scales, and we can get more bang for buck, more knowledge sharing, collaboration by working together. So I work on the Mid-Murray Floodplain Recovery Reach, which is funded through the Native Fish Recovery Strategy by the MDBA, and my presentation is about bringing back the Magnificent Six, this fabulous group of wetland specialist fish. How do I click through this one, Lance? Is it? Oh, that's not working. No. Sorry.
That's all right.
Oh, there's Nick. I'll keep on talking while we're going through the slides. Oh, here we go. Thank you. So just a bit of an overview of what I'll talk about. A little bit of detail about the Mid-Murray Floodplain Project. Some details about who the Magnificent Six are and their status and their threats. The key steps that we've got going forward to try and recover them at scale. And then I'll talk through a range of projects that are underway throughout the corridor, and some of the key challenges, successes, opportunities and knowledge gaps. So just quickly on the Recovery Reach program, this is an initial $750,000 from the MDBA. It's mainly around on-ground actions and community engagement to bring back these floodplain specialist fish. We're focusing on at least 6 to 8 wetlands for southern pygmy perch and southern purple spotted gudgeon, and also freshwater catfish. I'll talk mainly about the first two there. That's at the whole of Murray scale, and then more specifically, this is the actual geographic scope of the recovery reach here in the Mid-Murray, and we're developing a fish recovery plan for all fish species there. I won't talk about that any further, but if you're interested in that plan, please jump onto the Finterest website and get in contact with me if you've got any feedback, or you think there's missed opportunities or want to get involved in that. So, introducing the Magnificent Six. Here they are in all their glory. These are, I guess, a really overlooked and undervalued and underfunded set of wetland specialist fish. They're important in their own right, but they also play a really important role in the ecosystem, obviously being food for larger predators, large-bodied fish, and water birds in particular, which are also in decline across the basin, and important ecosystem processes in wetlands as well. They've been going missing over the last 50 to 80 years, really declining throughout the corridor. They would have previously been right through the floodplain wetlands, Barmah Forest, Gumbower Forest, around Mildura all the way to the lower lakes. And some of the key threats that have brought about their decline are alien fish, in particular carp. Ecosystem engineers destroy their key habitat, which is aquatic plants. Redfin perch, voracious predators, and gambusia as well. Loss of permanent floodplain wetlands throughout the corridor, so lack of seasonal flows into these previously permanent wetlands, and with the millennium drought on top of that, it was almost the nail in the coffin for a lot of these species. Habitat destruction in particular, loss of those aquatic plants and sedimentation of habitats, and all of this with the backdrop of a drying climate. It's sort of stacked up against them. So, firstly, there's the southern pygmy perch. It's probably in the best situation of these fish, despite the fact that it's just recently been listed as vulnerable. So it's not trending great, but it's probably from the best starting point of these. There are a fair few wild populations still left, and there are over 20 backup populations, farm dams, surrogate habitats, where these things are still existing. Southern purple spotted gudgeon. So at one point in time, this was thought to be extinct from the Murray Corridor. A population was found in South Australia at Jury Swamp, and breeding programs started from there. And more recently, in the Kerang wetlands, a population was discovered in 2019 at Third Reedy Lake, just before it was about to be drawn down. So some work was done there to see how far and wide these things were distributed. They were found at another 4 lakes in the area, so we've got a fairly good stronghold there. But we've also got 2 backup populations where they're recruiting. Murray hardyhead, I should be pointing these out as we go. I'm just assuming people know what they are, which is silly. Southern pygmy perch, beautiful purple spotted gudgeon. This is Murray hardyhead here. Murray hardyhead is a little different to the others. It's sort of distributed further down the system, around the Kerang area, the Sunraysia area, and into the lower lakes. These have been pushed to mostly saline habitats because they can still compete in these areas, without the threats of gambusia and carp. So they've sort of been forced into these saline habitats where they can still tolerate saline water quality and do okay. So there's 10 wild populations of those and 2 backup populations. Olive perchlet, considered extinct in Victoria, has been for quite a while. There's a population in the Lachlan catchment, and New South Wales Fisheries have recently established 1 backup population there as well. Yarra pygmy perch, unfortunately, are really the canary in the coal mine. They have declined to the point where there's no wild populations remaining. I believe it's the first fish in the MDB to go extinct. There's also populations, thankfully, of Yarra pygmy perch in the southern basins, so there are programs to try and bring them back. There's also some captive Murray-darling fish, so researchers down in South Australia are looking at genetic mixing and trying to bring that species back. Finally, I've been forgetting to point them out again. So that's olive perchlet, that's Yarra pygmy perch. Flat-headed Galaxus, this one's critically endangered, has received very little attention, thought to be extinct in New South Wales. Fisheries have been looking for them for the last 10 years, not found them. There's been the odd finding in the Mid-Goulburn region, but basically they're kind of known as the ghost fish. You find them once, go back and try and find them again and they're gone. Highly mobile species, very difficult to capture. We don't know where they are, so we don't know how many, if any, wild populations are left, and there aren't any backups. That's the Magnificent Six in a nutshell. The approach to bringing them back is essentially this. Firstly, where we know there's existing populations, protect those existing populations. Secondly, collecting brood stock and starting a captive breeding program to secure the species. And I'll talk about more of this stuff later on. Next, to reintroduce offspring into secure predator-free surrogate sites. These are like high-quality farm dams and urban wetlands that can be managed closely. And ideally, these act as a natural hatchery that you can then take fish from and translocate to the wild sites. Translocate to, I'm going to call them managed wild sites, so areas where we're delivering environmental water, we have a good degree of control over the site, potentially carp screening, strategic drying, things like that, to enable them to persist and then finally to get them back into the wild throughout the Murray Corridor. So that's the basic approach to what we're doing. And this is a table from Nick Whiterod's document. It just goes through the kind of considerations at surrogate sites and wild sites to introduce these fish. So they need really good physical habitat cover. So talking about rocks, woody debris, and in particular aquatic plants. They've got different water quality preferences, and then it's largely about the prevailing fish community as well. Are there large native predators? Are there competitors? Are there carp, gambusia, redfin? So those are sort of the factors we think about when setting up surrogate sites. Going to run you through a bit of an around the grounds for what's happening. So in the north central region, we're focusing on purple spotted gudgeon and pygmy perch. We've been funded to undertake a captive breeding program with the fish that were collected from Third Reedy Lake and Middle Reedy Lake. Genetics work is being completed on these fish, so it turns out that it's a fairly diverse, genetically diverse population, which is fantastic. Genetics have also been done on the brood stock, and it's quite diverse as well, which is good. We've set up 2 captive breeding facilities, one in South Australia with Glenelg Nature Trust, and one with a private breeder, Middle Creek Farm in Gippsland. They're doing a fantastic job. We've been working with local landholders and working for Victoria Cruise to go out and enhance some surrogate sites. And City of Greater Bendigo Council actually. Here's one of, where's Mark? I saw Mark here before. Raise your hand, Mark. This is one of Mark's beautiful sites, an urban site in Bendigo, where he has put in aquatic plants and woody habitat and riparian vegetation to create these beautiful surrogate sites that we can then move these fish to. So we had 12 sites that we've assessed, selected 4. I'll show you the results of that in a second. The breeding program will continue into next year, and Melbourne Aquarium have jumped on board, which is fantastic. They've got a Breed, Rescue, Protect exhibit that they're having down there. They'll be breeding up purple spotted gudgeon along with rainbow fish and olive perchlet as well to try and bring those species back to Victoria also. There are just some examples of some of the surrogate sites. Private farm dam. This one's a wetland that a farmer created on their farm up near Kerrang, specifically for bringing back wetland specialist fish. And there's another one of Mark's sites in Bendigo. The results so far are pretty good. We restocked fish into these surrogate habitats in December, and we've just been back to check for survival. They were about 2.5 centimetres when they went in. They're now between 6 and 7 centimetres, doing really well. Present at all the surrogate sites. So hopefully they recruit and we can then use these to take them out to wild sites. Also got a similar program in Bendigo for southern pygmy perch. This has been a partnership project between ANGFA, Native Fish Australia, City of Greater Bendigo and the CMA, where we've sourced some fish from their remnant populations in the upper catchment, started a breeding program, put them out into surrogate habitats, and they're now at the point where they're producing enough fish that we're translocating out into the wild. Yeah, this is just some more results, I suppose, of some of those sites. We're now at the point with pygmy perch where we're looking to move them back into managed wild sites and true wild sites, I guess. So one site is Sheepwash Creek in the Campaspe catchment, where we've released a small number of fish and they're already recruiting in there. We identified this site through species distribution modelling to see where these species would have previously occurred in pre-European settlement. So we look at historical data and also modelled data to work out where they might be and where they might be able to go back into. Doing really well there. We've released them in Black Charlie Lagoon in Gumbower Forest with Yorta Yorta. So far, unfortunately, no recaptures there, so we're looking to eDNA to see if they're still there. It's a large lagoon. They may be, they may not be. You know, this is, and I'll talk about it later as well. We need to be continually stocking to give them the best chance. It's not just a one-off flash in the pan type thing. We've got to continually stock and try and give them the best possible chance. And we've recently stocked them into Reedy Lagoon in Gumbower Forest with Barappa, and you know, amazing habitat there. Looking forward to see how they're going. We have some more works underway on the Loddon floodplain. I won't go into detail about this too much, only to say that we're sort of moving into wild sites. This is one that a landholder has a flood runner on his property, has screened it, planted aquatic veg, and we're looking to translocate pygmy perch in there soon. Up around Mildura, working on purple spotted gudgeon, pygmy perch and rainbow fish. We've got a joint project with New South Wales Fisheries, Mildura Council, First People of Millewa-Mallee and Ozfish Unlimited. So we're really focusing on these partnership projects. It's an urban lake, stormwater lake. It's been drained, pest fish have been removed, it's been refilled and screened. The aquatic plants have come back fantastic there. Ozfish have installed rock and timber habitat as spawning habitat for purple spotted gudgeon. Fish were released in December, and again we've recaptured fish there, so things are looking good for that site. Also up around Mildura, we're looking at some, I guess, semi-managed floodplain wetlands that can connect to the Murray River. So investigations are underway there, and they will be potentially sites for pygmy perch release. Moving on to Northeast Victoria in the Northeast CMA area, this is a project with Greta Valley Landcare, ARI Northeast CMA, and it's an extension of a project that's been going for a little while where local landholders, landcare groups have been offering up farm dams as surrogate habitats. It's been really successful. 2 populations have been established and are recruiting really strongly, and similar to the Bendigo sites, those fish are now being moved to other surrogate habitats and thinking about wild sites as well. So the focus for this project will be moving fish to areas where they can connect into the King, 15 Mile Creek and King River system. There's also on-ground works at these sites as well, and translocations planned for August or September this year. Moving on to the Murray Local Land Services area. This is a really great project. It's an extension of a project that's been going for 10 years. You know, heaps of groups involved here. These are the lagoons in the middle of Deniliquin and what they previously looked like, full of carp, really degraded habitat. And I guess it just goes to show how important partnerships are and you know, persistence in bringing back these small fish. So over 10 years, the group has been working to, you know, improve the habitat, get the community involved, get school kids involved, doing a fantastic job. So they've now released southern pygmy perch in there, which are, I think they've detected recruitment, which is great, and more recently purple spotted gudgeon as well. And there'll be follow-up monitoring to see how the gudgeons are going. On to Golden Broken CMA, they've got 2 projects, one focusing on freshwater catfish, which I won't go into too much detail about, but also a project at McClarty Lagoon, which is in the Goulburn River floodplain. It connects up to the Goulburn River, so this is one of these kind of semi-wilding type projects. The habitat's been assessed there and it's been deemed suitable for the fish. Over 600 pygmy perch have been translocated. They've just received a grant to do some habitat works with Tungarang, so willow control, re-snagging, wetland planting, carp control, and sampling there's planned for spring as well. So, really exciting things for southern pygmy perch throughout the basin. And finally, down to South Australia. I won't talk about Murray Hardyhead and Yarra pygmy perch. Nick, the next speaker, might talk a little bit about that. But they've got some work to secure their main surrogate site down at Beyond Wetland to expand that. They've also got some mesocosm trials planned down there, looking at screening out carp and seeing how the fish go in different habitat configurations within caged areas. They're also looking at a carp finger gate exclusion trial to see how efficiently these work by pit tagging carp and seeing, if they move out, whether they move back in, etc. So some really good work going on in there. I want to talk a little bit about flat-headed Galaxus because this one is in real trouble and there hasn't been much work done on these guys. So New South Wales Fisheries is currently developing an eDNA probe because we don't know where they are. We need to get out and find where they are and secure them. We're currently working with the Arthur Rylah Institute on a program to go and test that field probe, so some field sampling along with eDNA detections just to see how efficiently that's working. If we do discover some populations through that and they're reasonable size, we'd like to take some into a surrogate habitat to be able to study them further and just to have them secured somewhere. And then, it'll be a rollout of going in and looking throughout their former range for populations through eDNA work and hoping to get citizen scientists involved to assist with that, and also just to promote this find a flatty. If people are out fishing and get these fish in their bait traps, to make a call and let the fisheries authorities know, that they've found a population. So some exciting work there. A bit about the things that collectively we think are key success factors for rewilding species or, securing surrogates and rewilding species. Sites with high water security. I mean, the Millennium Drought was, a major threat to these populations. Obviously, we need places with high water security. Suitable habitat and the prevailing fish assemblage, which I've talked about previously. Partnerships are just so important. The most successful projects by far that we've been working on have involved a big range of partners: government, private sector, community members, traditional owners and researchers all working together. That seems to be the recipe for success. People engaged in the project, people keeping an eye on the project, people being environmental stewards. A site with an engaged landholder or land manager. So again, that it's not just a flash in the pan, that we're working on, a site for, 5 to 10 years and knowing that it's going to be cared for, looked after. Sustained reintroductions. I guess the case of trout cod is a really interesting one in that, it took 10 plus years to re-establish trout cod by ongoing stocking efforts. Can't just expect, one-off, throw fish in, hope they do all right, will work. And currently we're having the most success with, smaller sites, actively managed sites and not, large floodplain wetlands. That's obviously the goal, but there's baby steps to get there. That's just a photo of all of the wonderful people that have been working on that Deniliquin Lagoons project. Many, many groups and a really fantastic project. Partnerships is the key. The key challenges: people don't really even know about these fish to care about these fish. So raising awareness is a really important thing. Permits and approvals, they're always difficult to get, especially working across states. I think we're starting to build trust with some of these key agencies now, and the permits are becoming more streamlined. Genetics has been a really big barrier to moving forward in the past. I think we're turning a corner there as well. There's been some great work done in South Australia to show for pygmy perch, these used to be these isolated populations. They're not their own separate genetic beast, they're inbred and fragmented, and actually they used to be connected right throughout the Murray Corridor. So it's time to do some genetic mixing and create that, that diversity and allow these fish to cope with change. Ongoing funding, always an issue. Again, this is probably the most funding that's been thrown at small-bodied fish. So yeah, hopefully we can build on this. And European carp, one of the major threats, one of the major challenges, you know, with bringing them back to wild sites. Opportunities. There's an opportunity to get fisheries regulations up to speed. In Victoria, you're still able to catch purple spotted gudgeon, throw them on a hook and fish with them. Flat-headed galaxis as well. It's time to bring them up to speed, if we can, with the other fisheries regulations. And I think, you know, through this project is a good way to do that. There's real opportunity in urban sites, water-sensitive urban design sites, sites that are associated with housing developments. You know, these fish, they're actually fairly tolerant to poor water quality, you know, and they're really habitat specialists. We have secure water in urban environments. We have engaged councils and engaged people that live in urban spaces that want to see this kind of thing and can be stewards for these species. So I think there's potential to do more work in urban areas. The Landcare movement and landholders, I've been absolutely amazed at the amount of interest from private landholders wanting to give up their farm dam as surrogate habitats. I get the feeling that you know, Landcare's almost looking for that next thing to do, and this is piquing a lot of landholders' interests. We haven't even had to, for Bendigo, the Bendigo area, put out expressions of interest yet. It's just been people calling, offering their farm dams after seeing some media or you know, stories about this. So yeah, I think there's a real opportunity to capitalise on that and work with landholders, you know, so that they can have the skills to create suitable habitats. Of course, there's existing environmental water sites. These are the sites we need to focus on going forward with rewilding, looking at new environmental water sites. And then, of course, with the work that's going on, I think also creates opportunities for research to study some of these surrogate sites and how they're going. And the key knowledge gaps, surprisingly, breeding techniques is still a fair knowledge gap. You know, some of the private breeders are doing an excellent job and learning as they're going, and to get that information out there would be fantastic. Even, you know, for the purple spotted gudgeon, it's a different lineage. It's almost like a different beast compared to the ones sort of further north in the basin. Different behaviours, different breeding times. Yeah, completely different beast. Very similar looking, but water quality tolerances. These things have also been found at some of our surrogate sites in really low dissolved oxygen water. You know, they seem to be quite tolerant. We need to know more about that to know, you know, what we can offer up in terms of surrogate sites. There's an opportunity to look at habitat preferences, species interactions, the way we go about conservation, stocking as well, you know, the timing of the stocking. Do you do it just before the fish spawn and put them out there so that the young have the best chance in their new environment? Or do you let them settle in for 6 months? How many do you put in? How often do you put them in? And I guess big picture, there's a real opportunity to look at metapopulation processes to try and work out when we go to restock them in, for example, Barmah Forest or Gumbower Forest, how many sites, how connected are they? You know, we need to be thinking about at that scale within the forest, and then, you know, between different sites all the way through the Murray Corridor to try and optimise what we're doing. Oh, that's it. Thank you. Thank you very much for listening.
That was brilliant. Have you got some questions? Yes, Michelle.
With and under the FFG Act, at least marine fish, crustaceans and molluscs are regulated under the Fisheries Act rather than the FFG Act.
Yep.
Do you think does it actually provide any, is it true for freshwater fish as well?
Yep.
And, do you think it's a hindrance or provides an opportunity?
Yes, it is true for freshwater fish. They're under the Fisheries Act. And yeah, I think it provides an opportunity. I guess rec fishers also care for these fish, and you know they probably there probably needs to be more work done to raise the awareness of these fish. And like I sort of mentioned before, I think there's a real opportunity to bring the regulations up to scratch as well. Yeah, I think it's probably okay that they're managed under the Fisheries Act, but yeah, I think work needs to be done to get their protection in line with the other states in Victoria.
Suzette, yeah, we've got a microphone coming to you.
I had a question about biological control, and I know sometimes they can be catastrophic, and I'm particularly thinking of Queensland and the cane moth. But is CSIRO or is anyone working on biological control for carp and some of those really nasty predators?
Yeah, so there's the carp virus, which most people probably will have heard of. I haven't heard much recently on what's happening with the carp virus. You know, potentially a huge opportunity for these small fish and many other native fish species if that was successful and could be managed well. What else is there? Daughterless carp is another technology that's been talked about for a long time, but not implemented. I think that would have big time scales to actually get to where we'd need to be.
That could work for Gambusia as well. So
Exactly. Yeah. That's right. It could potentially work for Gambusia. Those are the only few that I know about. Carp is those three fish are a real concern, and really limiting where we can bring these things back and know that they'll do well. So, yeah, it's a good point. Probably needs to be looked at further.
we've got time for another question now, and then we'll have the Q&A session at the end. So, yeah. Thank you.
So there's lots of new developments in the outskirts of Melbourne at the moment, and they're building lots of artificial wetlands, which are pretty well revegetated. Are any of those a good opportunity for creating populations of native fish?
100%. Yeah. Why not? If they've got good habitat and they have permanent water, or a network of sites that can hold permanent water at different times, yeah, definitely is. Like I keep pointing at Mark Toohey here. He's from Bendigo and has been converting a lot of wetland sites, water-sensitive urban design sites into habitat for small-bodied fish, working with developers as well to make sure that when they're developing these wetlands, they're not just, square water retention basins. They've got topography in the wetland, they've got aquatic plants that are suitable and, can be suitable for this kind of thing. Massive opportunity, I reckon, and southern pygmy perch would be a great one. Maybe dwarf galaxids as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. I've got one quick question. Just wait, have a tick for the microphone.
Sorry, just picking up on your comment. There's a lot of land coming over in as urban parks. The issue is that it's coming over with wetlands to be designed purely for growling grass frogs. So we could end up with another helmeted money eater, right? Where all the money goes into one species, and I'm in charge of an area that a lot is coming over. So this is a really good opportunity, I think, to sell your wares.
Yeah, awesome. Yep.
Great.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much. Peter, can we thank him very much? Karen's going to come down and set Nick up for us. Yeah. So not everybody could make it in person, so Nick is coming to us on Zoom. I saw that he was there earlier, so we just have to explain.
Yes, I am. Can you hear me? Hello. Yep, yep. So I can share the screen if that's going to work. Okay, so I'll share from this end now. So there we go. Has that come up on the screen?
Hello, Nick. Can you hear me? It's Lance here. We're just getting the lights sorted
Recording
here
in
and
progress.
Introduce you from Nick Whiterod from the Nature Canal Trust, and he's going to talk to us about several conservation translocation projects that he's been responsible for. Over to you, Nick.
Okay, we all set? Okay, thank you. Thank you for Lance and the team for allowing me to talk today about freshwater conservation translocations. Unfortunately, I can't be there. And it makes it a little bit difficult, but it is sort of the way of the world these days. So hopefully you'll find some interesting points in my talk. And yeah, it's really about focusing on how conservation translocations can help recover freshwater species, often ones that are getting less attention than terrestrial species. And I guess, yeah, I work for a not-for-profit AquaSave Nature Canal Trust, and we've been doing a lot of conservation translocations for a range of species in the past. And I'm going to showcase some examples today and then provide some future directions for where translocations can go. But I'm first of all going to start, hopefully the next slide comes up. It's come up yet. With the conclusion. So they do work. Conservation translocations for freshwater species definitely work. So that's always the big one with any translocation, that you do get that sort of sentiment that, oh, well, if the species is meant to be there, they would be there, and translocations aren't going to work. You can't control all the threats. But from examples overseas, so this is the Oregon chub, occurs in Oregon in the US, and it solely through, predominantly through conservation translocations, reintroduction, and habitat management, it's been delisted from the US endangered species list. So they do work. Obviously, there's examples of them working in the freshwater context, and there's also examples in Australia, and I'm going to show you some examples today that I've been involved with, other examples too. So that's the main take-home message. They do work. There's a bit that is involved with them, but they definitely do work. And I guess this is the but section. So they do work, but they are complex. They do involve a range of social, behavioural, ecological, even economic and ethical, cultural considerations need to be taken into account when considering a conservation translocation for any species, really. And I guess where they may get their bad name from in the past is that they're often ill-considered, they're ad hoc, there's something that's not that well planned, and many have failed in the past, or they haven't been assessed. So people have had some money, had some resources, will put a particular species in an area. That's the job done. We won't actually worry about assessing the success of that translocation and then altering management to enable that population to establish. But with any field, and it is a rapidly growing field, conservation translocation science, there's a lot of new information out there, a lot of new strategy, and as I mentioned, there's a lot of successful examples are increasing throughout the world. And this one down here is just that Oregon chub. This is population through time from when it was listed with only 10 populations in 1992 to 2013, the number of populations that have the species increased to. So again, it can work. So just a quick step back on what conservation translocations are, and sorry if this has been covered already this morning, but I thought it's good context to show that they're not just reintroductions. There's a whole suite of translocations that can be undertaken. So as IUCN defines, it is the intentional movement and release of living animals, plants, for the primary objective of conservation benefit. Typically, it's for population restoration, so it's reinforcing an existing population for whatever reason, or most often it's reintroducing individuals back to a area within the former range of a species, and that's typically what's occurring. And a lot of the examples I'll be providing today are of that nature. But there are conservation introductions, which is essentially moving species outside the known natural range. So this could be assisted colonisation of a new area to avoid extinction if they're, where they've occurred is under threat and the species is under threat there, they can be moved to a new area outside of the range. Pedogalaxis in Tasmania is a good example of this. It's now lost to its former habitat and only survives in two populations outside of that natural range. And there's also ecological replacement for a specific ecological purpose. And this is probably where rewilding might come in. And yeah, and that's a new area that's sort of developing as well. And there's a range of motivations for why a conservation translocation can occur. Obviously, the recovery of a species is a big one. Genetic rescue of that species, rewilding. There's also cultural and social reasons why a conservation translocation may be undertaken. So I guess the point there is that it's not a simple, this species is in trouble, we can release them back to this spot, and that's what we're doing it for. There's a whole range of other motivations why people may want to implement translocation. So the focus of my talk is on freshwater ecosystems and freshwater species. So there are some differences in freshwater. Obviously the water is a big one, but there are some elements that make translocation slightly different in this context. So typically there's restricted habitat, streams, typically narrow, linear, obviously there's wetlands associated with them, but it's compared to reintroducing into a remnant patch of scrub, there's different considerations in terms of that restricted habitat. It's also dynamic habitat in Australia, particularly where that's experienced at the moment in northern New South Wales and southern Queensland. Flooding occurs, which can displace reintroduced individuals, but obviously drying and drought is a recurring impact on areas where freshwater species persist or where you may be looking to reintroduce them. And it goes without saying in Australia that many freshwater habitats are heavily altered. Those in the Murray-Darling Basin are really regulated. There's been a loss of floodplain inundation, a whole range of threats impact on these species. And for some, there's harvest pressure. So some species you may be reintroducing may in the future be exposed to commercial or recreational harvest that just imposes another threat on the species. The old one of species being underwater and out of sight, so they don't sort of have the same same public view potentially that some species, terrestrial species, koalas and other ones may have. So this also makes monitoring the recovery, monitoring post-release trajectories quite difficult. You can't sort of go out there and cite every individual. You have to do relative abundance to get an estimate of how the population's going. And typically freshwater species in Australia and all around the world receive less conservation attention. They get less conservation funding. There's less focus on their conservation and recovery. So that has been an impediment to the implementing conservation translocations for freshwater species. So that all said, I'm now going to run through some sort of small case studies on projects that I've been involved with that have had some success and have really benefited the species that were the target. So the first one is Murray crayfish. It is a keystone species, so it has a disproportionately large benefit to the ecosystems that occurs. And it also is polytrophic, so it's really important for energy flow through ecosystems. It's an ecosystem engineer. It can change bed structure, a whole range of things. So and it's bloody big. So it may grow to a foot long, and you may get thousands in a particular area in a healthy section. So it can have a huge impact on the ecosystems that occurs. It was once broadly distributed across the southern Murray-Darling Basin, but it has experienced historical declines and is really patchy now. And most recently, the Blackwater event in the southern basin, 2010-11, really impacted the species and led to an 80% population loss in impacted areas. Obviously, it's a long-lived species as well, so it's evolved to deal with Blackwater events and impacts, but it really has a limited recovery potential or a slow recovery potential. So it's slow growing, late maturing. It may take 6 or 7 years to reach maturity, and it's got restricted movement, poor disperser. So it will get back to areas that it's been lost from, but it may take centuries. And we've done some population modelling to indicate that it's decades to hundreds of years for the species to get back to areas where it's been impacted. So this shows the historical distribution of Murray crayfish across the southern Murray-Darling Basin in green there, all the way down to Murray Bridge in South Australia, the headwaters up through Victoria and New South Wales and into the ACT, and then a large section through the lowlands, Murray-Darling Basin, the Murray, the Murrumbidgee, Edward, Goulburn, all sorts of tributaries that used to occur. We've done a lot of, over the last 10 plus years, we've done a lot of monitoring across its range, and this figure just shows where it now occurs. So the red dots are where we haven't recorded it. Green dots are where we're picking the species up. So if you subtract that away, we're really looking at a current range more like this, where the green is. And then that Blackwater event I described or mentioned really impacted a large section of the river. So from pretty well Barmah Forest down in the Murray, through the tributaries there, and also through the Murrumbidgee and in the Murray into South Australia. So the translocation that we've been involved with for the last 5 years has really focused on that dot there just near Echuca. So it's an area that supported the species quite previous to the Blackwater event. So they were there fine before the Blackwater. The Blackwater came along and completely wiped them out. So there's known populations within 50 kilometres, but as I mentioned, the chances of them recovering and getting back there naturally is going to take a long time. So we developed a strategy to implement wild-to-wild translocation. So there's a whole range of ways to source individuals for translocation, but given the still remnant populations upstream of this site that are going well, we decided on wild-to-wild translocations, and it's really to kickstart recovery. So get individuals there and get that population recovering and developing, growing ahead of time. And there hasn't really been much done with spiny crayfish, Murray crays, and other crayfish in terms of translocation strategies. There's some historical translocations of the species close to 100 years ago where they were introduced to the Lachlan and Macquarie rivers, but that was fairly ad hoc, like some of those ill-considered reintroductions I talked about earlier. So we've really had an opportunity to develop a strategy from scratch, and there's a lot of information we've gathered over the last 10 years that did inform that strategy and the implementation. So there's been genetic assessments, there's been population modelling, obviously understanding where populations are, where strong source populations are. All of that was fed into the strategy. And the aim was quite simple: to re-establish self-sustaining populations of the species while minimising risk, particularly to the source populations. We were fairly confident, given the Blackwater disturbance had stopped that particular one anyway, that the habitat would be suitable for the species. So that was sort of the main aim, and we really had a commitment, we still do, to long-term assessment of the population to make sure that it is persisting, given that recovery potential. By restocking this area, it's still going to be a lengthy process to recover the species in this location. So this is the fun bit. This is all the catching lots of crayfish, genetic sampling. We've released more than 1,000 individuals over 5 years. It's got a genetic sample from each of them, and yeah, it's good fun catching lots of crayfish and working out ways to transport them without them destroying each other. So the top right photo there is crayfish with sheep castration rings on their claws for a short-term transport, so that they're not destroying each other, and show that it doesn't have any long-term adverse impacts on the species, but it does, yeah, they're quite aggressive animals, so it does sort of limit that in transport. And releasing them. And we've been monitoring the population since the releases, and it's the relative abundance since the release time. So obviously before the releases, there was no individuals. And since that time, there's been a gradual increase in numbers over time. And importantly, we've been seeing the presence of buried females, so female crayfish with eggs, indicating that in situ reproduction's occurring, which we thought would be the case. But it's always good to document that. And yeah, there's a increasing trend in the population relative abundance. That it's perhaps not as quick as we thought, but in these early years, given the numbers we put in, but we do have that sort of understanding from the species biology about how slow growing they are and late maturing. So we've been doing 5 years of releases. So there's unlikely to be any juveniles that of the individuals we stocked that will be present yet. So we haven't sort of got that wave of new recruits occurring into the site. So it's more the population that we released is what we're sampling at the moment. And I guess another point to mention, we did release 1,000 adults, but as you can see with the females with eggs, we also released probably close to 80 buried females. So they can have up to 2,000 eggs. So in effect, we're releasing a huge number. If some of them survive, we're releasing a huge number of individuals. But again, they haven't shown up yet in the population. So we're going to continue monitoring this population to see the trajectory over time. So another thing we've been working on is a strategy to release them back into South Australia. You can see the dots shifted now over to South Australia. They were historically quite common in the South Australian section of the River Murray. They haven't been recorded for 40 years. We've, over the last 5 years, went out and sampled, it was over 8,000 net hours throughout the SA section of the Murray, pulled up a lot of nets with no crayfish in them to confirm they weren't present. But we also, through that work, identified a couple of spots that could support the species. And the key thing down in South Australia is that the regulation of the river has created weir pools that are slow flowing areas of the river. And these species really need oxygenated flowing water. But there are a number of spots below a couple of the weirs that could support the species. And we have developed a strategy of where to get them from, all sorts of where to source them, how to release them, all these kind of things, building on the work we've done near Echuca. So that's a long-term plan to reintroduce them. And this is really getting to that rewilding where they haven't been there for 40 years. The ecological function they once carried out has either been lost or taken up by another species, but we're really keen to get them back, reintroduce the population, get it re-established and start re-kick that ecological functioning that the species provides back in. So that's all on Murray crayfish. So yeah, it's been successful over the project so far. There is scope, as I mentioned, to release them to further locations and go from there really. So the next species is Murray hardyhead. It's a small-bodied, short-lived, salt-tolerant species. So it may only live for a year to 18 months. They're a real boom and bust species. They, when conditions are right, can be caught in huge numbers, but conditions haven't been right in a lot of cases. So they once were widespread, but with river regulation and the loss of floodplain wetlands, they've really been impacted. And so they only occur in the lower lakes, but also up to 10 isolated wetlands throughout the rest of the Murray-Darling Basin associated with the Murray. And they haven't been recorded in New South Wales for more than 20 years. And this was just to make sure you're all watching. That's actually some crayfish in that photo there that shouldn't be there, but they're pretty cool looking. So that should hopefully, that's a good change from small-bodied fish. All right. So the key to this species is really identifying saline freshwater wetlands. So they do have a salt tolerance to almost twice salt water, the sea, which is quite phenomenal for a freshwater fish. But their early life stages, particularly eggs and egg hatching, needs fresher conditions down to probably half seawater. So the way that these sites have been identified is really finding saline elements of the landscape, ensuring you can get environmental water to that site so you can create a regime that freshens it up during spring when they are spawning so you can get egg hatching, and then allowing the site to naturally increase in salinity over summer to wipe out competition or lessen competition from less salt tolerant species. And that regime is developed through years of work by colleagues and also some salt tolerance testing recently by colleagues at Arthur Ryall Institute. And it's really showing, implementing that strategy is really showing how best to manage the species. So there's a number of sites that are managed this way, and it's been the focus of the New South Wales population. So a site was identified, Little Frenchman's Creek near Lake Victoria, and it's a really strong partnership. So it's on private land. New South Wales Fisheries are heavily involved. A bunch of not-for-profits involved with site management, environmental water from the Chuo, fish from South Australia, from the Landscape Board, our involvement. And those partnerships have really been critical because it hasn't been smooth sailing necessarily across the board. And there's been a number of obstacles in terms of water delivery. But those partnerships allowed the project to stay the course. So we released fish close to 1,000, only 1,000 in late 2018. And we reinforced the population early 2020. And with only a couple of thousand fish, so relatively low numbers. And sampling undertaken by colleagues at New South Wales Fisheries last week caught over 200,000 Murray hardyhead at this site, which is a record for the species. Previous to that, we've got a site that's well managed in South Australia where we were catching 25,000 fish during one sampling round and thought that was a really good result and a really robust population. But this is obviously next level. And I guess it does show those strong partnerships. Managing the site for the species can achieve successful outcomes. And now the keys are to keep this population going, continue that management, but also utilise this population as a source for the subsequent reintroductions in the region, recreating a natural dispersal and colonisation. So there'd be booms at certain wetlands, then there would be connection, those fish would disperse out and recolonise new areas. So sort of recreating that regional metapopulation and making sure that we're not isolating each individual population and managing it separately, but really allowing dispersal to occur if it has to be through releases or naturally, but really sort of aiming at that regional level conservation of the species. Another success story is the re-establishment of southern pygmy perch in the lower lake. So this is another small-bodied species, and through population monitoring, we confirmed that it was lost from the lower lakes, particularly Lake Alexandrina and fringing habitat. And it's not too hard to see why. If you can see the picture there, the lakes went 1.5 meters below sea level at the height of the drought. All that fringing habitat was dry, and there's a range of species that were impacted during that time. But fortunately, colleagues, particularly Mike Hammer, rescued a bunch of fish out. They were put into a genetically informed captive breeding program at Flinders University. And then we implemented fish releases back into former habitats once the water came back in 2012 and beyond. Again, not huge numbers, but yeah, it's strategically located at sites that do support them and did have habitat that had recovered. And there's been long-term population, but also genetic monitoring of released individuals. And it confirms that whilst they were lost, there's now the reintroduced population has expanded, is increasing in its range and its number at specific sites. And those reintroduced, the individuals that are caught now are the sole progeny of that captive breeding program. So we're not getting any wild individuals caught across the region. So without reintroduction, pygmy perch may have been lost to the lower lakes. So this is a really important success story of how translocation can benefit small-bodied freshwater species. But with every positive, there's a negative, and this is closely related species, Yarra pygmy perch. It's almost compare the pair, so very similar, was lost during the droughts. Individuals were rescued out, captive breeding program, releases occurred, and unfortunately it didn't re-establish at all. Re-established for up to 18 months in a number of locations, but it hasn't persisted. So there hasn't been an individual caught in the wild since 2015, and that was 6 months after releases. And we've done some quite intensive surveys to try and find them, and we haven't had any success. So the species now considered extinct from the Murray-Darling Basin, and now we're moving to a genetic rescue where we're looking at fish from other parts of Australia where they do occur, mixing them with, we have some surrogate backup populations, but not in the wild of Yarra pygmy perch, and looking at improving genetic health of the species and then looking to release them in the future. And another project it's not at the stage of releasing. Yep. Perfect. I've only got a couple of slides, so we're this is just a community-led bellfrog project. So it's really looking at what the community wants, what they were the driving force behind establishing a captive breeding facility for this species, and then also coupling that with a recovery plan for the lower lakes for the species. And whilst we haven't released any fish back into the wild, frogs back into the wild, I should say, there's a really good community support of the project. There's volunteers that are maintaining frogs and tadpoles, and it's a really successful program in that essence. But we're looking over the coming years to produce individuals to release to the wild. So just a couple of last slides. So the keys that I've found to success really comes down to process and planning, production, successful implementation, and also promoting these species. So you can all see there, the planning needs to be considered collaborative and transparent. You need to commit to long-term implementation. You need to have sufficient individuals for release and also promote the benefits of translocations and the species. And the last slide is just where some of the areas where I feel translocations are going to go for freshwater species. So I feel that they're going to be increasingly required, and there will be that need. And it's already occurring, as I've indicated, that sound science and planning is required to guide them. For some species, we're working on bushfire impacted spiny crayfish, and the key management activity is short-term emergency rescues during drought or during fire, and then putting back into that habitat. That's really a lot of the only things that can be done for some of those species. And for others, the western swamp tortoise in WA, they're looking at assisted colonisation, moving it outside of range. So they've done a bunch of mapping of climate change impacts and where preferred habitat will be in the next 50 years. And they're looking to release individuals into those areas to sort of get ahead of any climate change impacts on the species. And I guess that's something that may come up more and more in translocations, where you're no longer just considering the natural range, but you're looking at a longer term time frame on where conditions will be suitable for the species. Thank you. Thank you.
Run out of time for questions, but Nick, are you able to stay on and come back for the Q&A session or not?
Absolutely, yep.
Okay, well, we should be able to, plug you in for that. So that'll be great. Thank you very much. So we'll move on to our next speaker. We're actually going on to land, and we're going, Lawrence Berry from Australian Wildlife Conservancy is going to talk about reintroduction of mammals
Recording stopped.
in fenced reserves.
Hello. Great. Hello. All right. A bit of change of tack. We're talking about threatened Australian mammals. Hopefully the project that I described's got some commonalities with freshwater work. As you'll see, there's some stuff that's quite similar to what was talked about this morning. So let's jump into it. Is this going to play? No. So the project I'm talking about is a partnership between AWC and the New South Wales government under the Saving Our Species program. It's a $30 million investment over 10 years to deliver the reintroduction of regionally extinct species into 2 national parks, so one at Pilliga in northern New South Wales and one at Manly Cliffs. So I'll focus the talk on that today. So at a range of conservation objectives, critical weight range mammals across the country, a lot of them used to be widely distributed and now they're found in a few isolated remnants. Some are not found on the mainland at all and just on predator-free offshore islands. So the main objective for the project was to increase the global population size of some of these species just as a critical conservation intervention. Establishing viable, self-sustaining populations of this species are important. So whilst I'll be talking about fences, right, we're talking about natural processes trying to occur in those areas. The species are also ecosystem engineers in some sort of way, and where they're not, they also have roles in regulating a load of processes in the environments and interactions with other species. Also there's the flow-on consequences for extant species of implementing these sorts of large-scale interventions. And the project's really about, turning the tide on extinctions. That's one of the cheesy catchphrases we use quite a bit. Trying to turn it around, steady the ship. How do you get them outside fences? In the short term, this is what we need to stop them from disappearing. But there's a bigger picture outlook there. So here's 10 of the species that we're looking to put into Mallee Cliffs. They're selected based on that area being part of their former distributions, records from people like Blendowski, who travelled around, subfossil records and those sorts of things. So I'll introduce you to a few of these species throughout the talk. So just for a bit of area context, there's Mallee Cliffs. It's in far southwestern New South Wales. It's the Murray region and the Darling or the Barker. It's Barkindji country, Dingali country over towards the border, and Karinji down this way, the native groups. It's mallee country, about 280 millimetres of rain a year. Some really neat extant species in those environments too. Scotia Sanctuary is a long-term project that AWC has been running for about 20 years and has delivered reintroductions into a fenced area there. So you got a contract on the table from the government, reintroduce all these species. Yeah, righto. Okay, where do you begin? So you might look at some of the correlates of reintroduction success, and that's the elimination of the key threats, which for these species is feral cats and foxes. Then you might look at the size of the release areas, probably another really important factor, because it contributes to a load of different things. So genetic diversity, the overall size of the population you're going to be able to maintain, resource availability, competitive pressures between species. So removing threats and having a really big area to release them in is really important. And then there's other factors like founder size, the number of individuals you release. You see thousands of fish over years, is what you need in some cases. I wish there were thousands of these mammals to let go sometimes. So once you've got that, you sort of know what you have to do. You look at, well, how do you go about doing it? And there's some thoughts here on translocation tactics. So there's things focused on the actual species and their attributes, their genetics, the demographics of your release groups, things like that. And then there's environment-focused tactics. So when we're thinking about, well, okay, so the key threat to these species is feral predators. All right, we need to eliminate feral predators. Well, we don't have gene drives yet. We don't have really good methods of removing them at a landscape scale. So conservation fencing, these sorts of really intensive fences with floppy tops and skirts and electric wires, are the answer for now for some of these species, and many of them only occur in these sorts of areas on the mainland. So you're thinking, right, okay, we've got to do that. How do we design them? So there's two key factors that come out of this sort of thinking, and that's the habitat composition. Is it suitable for the species you're releasing? And is the area the right sort of size and shape? So how do you find that out? Some of these species are really rare. They're quite, they don't occur in a lot of areas. So we looked at Scotia Sanctuary, and it's part of the reason we were contracted to do this work is we've got some experience in the space. But one of the problems, one of the challenges, I guess, in this area is a lot of this research hasn't been written up. So there was a lot of monitoring done at Scotia over the years. These are spotlighting observations over time for a few of the species there, but it hadn't really been processed. So we jumped into it and we wrote that up using some methods that you do on telemetry to look at like what sort of landscapes and habitat areas are these animals using. And we compared that to some work that had been done by some PhD students about 10 years before when they were released. And we found some really interesting stuff. So here's two of the species, a bilby and a numbat, some of the habitat types, and it differs. But we found, interestingly, that the habitat preferences changed over time. So if you're thinking long term through these projects, what you might see initially or what you might think, you know, that might not be what eventuates 10 years down the track. There's also a thought in this space when you're dealing with recovery teams and other people trying to justify it is, you know, the habitat types are based on the current distribution of where some of those species are, which might not reflect the broad range of habitats they used across their former distributions. And basically what we found in this study was that if you're looking at building new fences in that part of the world, you need to aim for the maximum diversity of habitats you can and kind of have a more even proportional representation of those types, particularly when you think about 10 species going in. So you're balancing all of those needs. So once you've figured that out, where do you put your fence? A lot of fences, like this one at Scotia, are square because blokes who build fences like square shapes. They're like no corners. Scotia also started with stage 1 just by itself, so 4,000 hectares at the bottom, and then the top one was added later on. So they're often built based on logistical constraints rather than actual factors related to the purpose of the project, like the mammals and what sort of space they need. So this is the weird shape we ended up with at Mallee Cliffs, which took a lot of convincing with some of the stakeholders, particularly people building it, lots of corners. But you'll see the original area the fence was going to go in was this one, because it's square down here. But you'll see the habitat configuration is quite different, just the various colours. I don't need to know what they are for now. But so we chose the configuration based on that prior study. And then area, right? I mentioned area being an important, having an important relationship with a range of processes. For the amount of fencing that we were allowed to buy in the contract, we managed to squeeze out a really large area. So the original fence here was going to be just under 8,000 hectares, and we got it more up to 9,500. But there were a few compromises. So we tried to get this nice round shape. A circle's kind of the most efficient shape for the area. But there are a few considerations like fire risk from flammable Spinifex mallee and avoiding areas where someone had seen a threatened bird like 20 years ago. So we had to move the fence line a bit. And then once we decided where to put it, we had to eradicate the feral predators out of there. So it took about 4 months to clear the fence line and build the fence. So actually building and constructing the major bit of infrastructure happens quite rapidly, although that was 4 years into the project, so there's 3 years of talking about it and going through all the approvals first. And then the eradication process took about 8 months to get all the cats and foxes out of that area. We actually started doing predator control beforehand and then implemented the fence or built it during that period to kind of stop that compensatory immigration that you get. So you see at the beginning, you know, you get most of your predator activity and you knock down most of the population straight away. And we did that through, you know, baiting, trapping, shooting, those sorts of techniques. But the grey in the background represents the amount of effort that we were putting in terms of monitoring. And, you know, that goes up and you know, it takes quite a lot of time to get the last couple of animals. And here's just some of the metrics around the effort that involves. One of the key successes for us, one of the key factors in having success was just consistent effort. We had people working every day. And I think the last soft jaw trap that caught the last fox had been checked and opened for 10 weeks before it caught the last fox. So someone's checking it every day for 10 weeks. And instead of thinking, oh, I'll just move that, you know, they got it in the end. So persistence. Also having spatially focused effort was really important in getting the efficiency and the targeted management. So we did track dragging to look for signs of foxes. We had camera traps and we had some other techniques for trying to find their locations. And the dots are sort of the detections, and then the blurry little tiny crosses on these horrendous diagrams are the captures where we found them. So you'll see, you know, at the beginning we're getting pretty widespread effort, detections, and then it sort of drills down to smaller areas where we could target trapping and that sort of thing. So really using that spatially focused approach kind of improved the efficiency of the whole process. So once it's feral free, we can focus on moving forward with the reintroductions. And, you know, we consider some of these animal focused tactics in doing that. So I'll just pull up this next slide, which just sort of I can talk through a couple of examples of different things that we do. So we also use captive breeding, like in the fish space in some instances, but there's wild-to-wild releases that you might do. You might there's a range of different tactics you can apply. One of the critical factors is a lot of these populations are very small in the wild, and a lot of people who manage them are very protective about them, rightly so in some cases. So we use captive breeding in a couple of different ways. So for the greater stick-nest rat, that's a small native rodent that only occurs on the Franklin Islands, which is an island off the coast of Ceduna in South Australia. That's the last remaining extant population. We use captive breeding there to be able to source, a number that we found. So 30 was the number we took off the island, and that was recommended by geneticists as a reasonable number to base a new population on, based on the genetics of that population. And we use captive breeding to essentially boost the founders. So we're minimising impact at the source, but as I mentioned earlier, the founder size being a key correlate of success, we're trying to boost the numbers up. And then, instead of thousands of fish, we're dealing with 100. That's quite a healthy number for a mammal reintroduction. But another neat thing you can do with captive breeding is have a lot more control over your genetic mixing. So this is a red-tailed phascogale, really neat, Carnivorous dasyurids, arboreal. And this is some fragmented woodland in southwest WA in the Dryandra region. It's a really neat part of the world if you get the chance to go there. But you'll see that in the bottom here, there's a lot of little fragmented patches, and they support genetically different populations of phascogales, but there's not a lot of connectivity, so they're there's a lot of relatedness in those populations. But by getting animals from different fragmented and related populations that are unrelated between them, you can breed that out. So you end up with more diversity by mixing them. So we use the captive breeding program at Adelaide Zoo, in this case, to do just that, and we've ended up with the most diverse phascogale population in the country now than any single remnant in that area, although at the meta-population level it's quite diverse. So there's some neat things you can do with captive breeding. You can also release captive bred animals just to boost the overall genetic diversity of your mix. So for bilbies, we source them from the wild at Scotia in the fence there, and from a reintroduced wild population on Thistle Island that's near Port Lincoln. And we got 10 captive bred animals from zoos, and I'll show you a slide about how that went a bit later on. But that just increases the overall diversity. Hopping mouse, we use captive breeding in the same way we did for the stick-nest rat. So I'll just run you through some of the reintroductions we've done to date into the fenced area there. We reintroduced 60 bilbies, as I just showed you, in October 2019 from a range of different sources. We initially released them into a smaller 480 hectare breeding area within that 9,500 hectare fenced area to allow the genetic mixing of animals from those different populations. So that was part of a genetic strategy put together by Andrew Weeks. And then once that population had hit a target of 120, which was what we deemed the carrying capacity of that area, we released the F1 and F2 animals, so the progeny of the founders, into that bigger area, and we did that last year. And we were able to do some pretty interesting monitoring in that fenced area. We've got cage traps, so we check them over time. There's a lot of interest from parks for us to do that more regularly, given the data deficiency. They've not done a lot of this sort of work before, so they're very keen to have a lot of data. And one of the interesting things was when we were doing this reintroduction, we'd proposed the monitoring method, and the recovery team said, "How are you going to monitor bilbies?" We said, "Oh, we're going to use cage traps." And they said, "Oh, you can't catch them in cage traps. We don't catch them at Astrebla or in the Tanami Desert that way. They don't go into them." But you see at the bottom here, total individuals captured. We're having pretty healthy numbers caught each time. And we're able to get a whole range of rich data off those individuals. Their body weight, their health, their breeding, genetic samples off new animals and that sort of thing. So it's a really rich data set that you're able to build to help inform your management. You can work out population densities fairly accurately when you're getting good numbers. Down here's body condition over time. So you see the founders originally, a body condition score of 4 is pretty good. 5 is ideal. So this variation's a bit distorted because it's still good. But the founders, it increased over time. This drop is to do with recruitment. You've got new animals coming into the population. and then as they grow, they sort of get up to the right level. So for an animal that's not been in the landscape for 200 years, you take away predators, you put them in, hey, guess what? They do pretty well, which is great. So this graph over here shows the difference between the really fat zoo animals we released at their weights at the beginning with the wild ones, and they maintain that weight advantage for about 12 months until they all become similar. You've got new animals being recruited into the population here and growing successfully, which is good. Oh, great, video works. So this is a really cool animal. This is a stick-nest rat that I mentioned before on Franklin Island. This is one we didn't end up taking because we caught so many over there. Yeah, I'll let that run. So we did this release over 3 tranches. So we released, based on the captive breeding, we kind of, and just trialling it, you know, we released a few to make sure that they went all right before throwing the whole 100 out there. And that 100 that we released came from 30 founders sourced from this island. So that's a stick-nest rat, really cool. And this is Franklin Island. It's a no-access wilderness area, but I hear there's really good fishing there if you've got a boat. And the survival of that initial cohort was 50 to 70%, so that's quite low for an initial reintroduction. But we found that another threatened species on the park, the Murray-Darling carpet python, really had a thing for them. I radio tracked a couple of them down into a python one day, which was good. And goannas and things. So that predation rate was mostly due to native mammals. But in other releases, we sort of changed our approach and we achieved a higher than 70% survival rate. We've still got animals persisting. We just caught some last week that are breeding and doing really well. So another animal we released in December 2020 was the numbat, and it's a good day when you see a numbat. So this is Area Manager Joe Gorman from Parks releasing one. And the approach we took from those is to mostly get them from Scotia, where we've got a good genetically diverse population, and yeah, so far we've released 35, so 15 from Scotia in 2020 and 15 in 2021, with some from Perth Zoo. Just had a bit more genetic diversity this year. So the survival rate was pretty much 100% in the first year. I've got to say 70 because there was a few we didn't find again, but I know they're alive, so it's 100%. And then the most recent release, we had one mortality due to overexertion when running away from a predator was the finding of the pathology report. So survival rate was 95% and we had one other collar that failed. Much better recovery rate of the collars. So it's based on VHF telemetry monitoring those survival rates. We've released brush-tailed bettongs recently as well. That's a quick one. You miss them if you're not paying attention. We released 70 of those recently in September, with 54 of them from Mount Gibson Sanctuary. So that's a really good example of another fenced area there that was set up properly with good genetic mixing, able to take pressure off wild populations by providing founders for new projects. So that's another important role that these sorts of areas can provide. And we also took some out of Scotia as our part of winding back the population up there due to the recent drought. And we had a 95% survival rate of those animals. So again, a really good example of this being successful. And there's one. And here's my team, massed up, not socially distancing. And I just wanted to talk about birds for a minute. And some of the other impacts of these projects is their benefits for extant fauna. So we're seeing a range of, we're starting to see now through our just ongoing background monitoring, some of the implications, albeit pretty early stuff. So some ground-dwelling or threatened birds, chestnut quail thrush, southern scrub robin. The green is the percentage of sites occupied inside the fence, and the yellow is outside. And you can see pretty much across the board for those threatened species, we're starting to see a bit of a trend. And for malleefowl too, so this is breeding activity, the number of active mounds across the park. So this is across the whole park. In 2021, we saw some of the highest levels since 2011, so in over a decade. And this line's rainfall, so despite, not rainfall that's nowhere near that sort of levels, we're still getting good breeding activity. We built the fence here, and I think 80% of those mounds were inside the fenced area. So a really good sign for that species and something we're starting to look at a little bit more. So overall, the project's been pretty successful to date. We're still halfway through. We've done 5 of the 10 mammals. Pilliga's up there near Narrabri, the other project. But the consequence has been parks have been pretty happy with how it's going, and they've decided to invest in 4 new fenced areas, including a massive 40,000 hectare one at Yathong in central New South Wales. So it's a good example of, we go into this as an NGO to try and have impact, beyond the boundaries of our own organisation. And I think, having that success and seeing that investment in them has been really, really good and rewarding. So, thanks for the time to talk this morning. And that's kind of it.
Thanks very much, Lawrence. That's great. We've got time for a couple of questions. If we can put your hands up and I'll point to you, and someone with a...
Yeah, g'day, Mark Backman from Nature Glenelg Trust. That was great, thank you. I'm just curious about how you have, or whether you're prepared for telling the more complicated story over time, which is unlikely that everything will be doing fantastically well, because presumably as the new ecology settles in, maybe some of the things that initially are doing really well because the feral predators have been taken out, once you've got a more complex ecosystem, I guess what we would all hope is that you settle into something that's more long-term sustainable, but maybe the winners aren't spiking so high anymore. How do you go talking your supporters through, expectations, and how you prepare for the fact that there are winners and losers when environments change, and that goes for after reintroductions as well?
Yeah, thanks. That's a really good question. I find more than the supporters, the more challenging ones dealing with the regulators and dealing with a system that is set up around having impact. It's set up around projects have impacts, and if things decline, that's a bad thing. I guess, adaptive management is one of the ways you do it, and the long-term monitoring is really critical to that. And I guess if you've got values, there's key threatened reptiles or something that some of these mammals might eat, you just keep track of that, and you implement mitigations if the values that you want to protect decline. But I guess it's about change. That's the whole essence of rewilding, I suppose, isn't it? Is you restoring these ecosystems and the processes in them to something before. The ground dwelling mammals, they have a pretty big impact on the soil crust. They do a lot of diggings, and that can flow on to other ecosystem processes like seed germination and things like that. I guess that ongoing monitoring, working with people, and just being prepared to work through challenges. They're ongoing experiments. A lot of the issues we encounter, I guess, or the challenges in the reintroduction space, are people want certainty and they want to know what's going to happen. But I guess it's just keep having conversations, keeping people involved, and being prepared to adapt to what you're doing.
I'm in a suburban council, and we've got a fenced reserve because it used to be an explosives reserve, so people aren't allowed in there. And we'd love to, long term, have it be an area where we could reintroduce some really small mammals, because it's not a huge area. But where do you suggest we start? Maybe a long question.
I guess you start with just setting realistic goals, understanding what it is that you're trying to do and whether that's the most adequate solution for your problem. So for some of these species, this is the only solution in this part of the world. But the resourcing required is way more than what you think. We went into this as a partnership model, so there's some co-funding for AWC. And I don't know what, gentlemen's club they drew up the contract in Sydney, but, and what they were on when they did it, but it was way out in terms of the estimate, and we're way overexposed in terms of the investment that we've got to make into it. It's an important conservation action, so you try and find the funding, but, it is a huge amount of investment in time and in resources. So yeah, I guess I'd look at what your aims are. Is it what you need to do? And then I'd just consult widely with people who've done it and try and don't reinvent the wheel, try and pick up on something else. Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty long question.
Wes,
Yeah, no
Last question, yeah.
Hi, Wes Ward. I'll keep it short from Charles Sturt Uni. I noticed that most of the original and the new sites are in national parks. Have you had interest from private landholders, and to what level?
Yeah. So we partner in other parts of the country. We've got a partnership with pastoralists in the Kimberley at the Bulloo River, or in that sort of part of the world. We've been approached recently by Trust for Nature at Ned's Corner to have input into a fencing project there. Yeah, I guess we're about to announce a NAPCO partnership. So in Queensland with it's like a farming group there, managing some of the monitoring and that sort of conservation work on private land. Yeah, I mean, a key part of having, this project going forward, it's about trying to release animals into the broader landscape too. A key part of that's integrated pest management at a broad landscape scale. Something really neat about the fish projects is how it's landscape focused, not just a discrete patch. So we engage a lot with LLS and local landholders to do baiting and that sort of thing, and have buy into the project at a bigger scale, because that's kind of what's going to be needed. But yeah, I find there's heaps of interest from landholders, and it's just trying to, finding the resourcing, I guess, to make more ambitious things happen in that space. Great.
Okay, thanks very much, Lawrence. Please thank him. That's great.